creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Monday edition of Point of View. And as we said on Friday, you might remember that Penna Dexter and I were talking about the fact that in the past, oftentimes December was a little bit more of a quiet month. We used to jokingly say maybe we should actually put together some kind of feature on the Point of View Home and Garden Show, because oftentimes Congress was in recess. The Supreme Court was not issuing any major decisions, and it was a time which we could reflect on a variety of different topics that aren't necessarily driven by the news cycle. And then I said, of course, it isn't quite the same. And of course, we even alluded to the fact that on Monday, maybe we could spend some time talking about on the Middle East. And then, of course, Syria broke out, and Syrian rebels have now captured the capital of Damascus. And the longtime dictator, President Bashar al-Assad, is actually in exile in Russia. I will get to that, but that will probably be in the second hour, where we'll do a deep dive into what is happening in Syria and what that means. If that's not enough, it turns out now that it looks like law enforcement have been able to arrest the individual who is responsible for the murder of the United Healthcare CEO, Brian Thompson. They found this individual with a fake ID, with a gun that is like the one that was used, a variety of other, even a handwritten manifesto. I think we've actually captured him, so we'll talk more about that later. And for those of you that have been watching, of course, not only in New York, but the trial of Daniel Penny, is the Marine veteran who was trying to prevent Jordan Neely from killing people, but was then arrested for homicide, negligent homicide charge. He has been found not guilty, and we'll talk more about some of the reaction to that as well. So as you can imagine, we're not necessarily in the same circumstance that we've been in the past, but we still had planned to spend some time today to talk about some things that would be most helpful to you during this season. We did a program last week on Advent. Today we're going to talk about liturgy, and I think you will appreciate the conversation, but stay tuned, because we will soon enough get back to some of these issues in the news, as well as many other articles that I've posted here today, not only about Syria, but also this time last week, you might remember we were talking with Pastor Jack Graham about Bible sales are increasing. We'll get into those facts and figures, some things about Trump nominees, and a variety of others. Might not even get all of it in today, but we will certainly do our best. So let's, if we first of all can spend some time talking with Douglas Kaine McKelvey, who is an individual who grew up in East Texas, moved to Nashville back in about 1991 to participate in the early work of Charlie Peacock's Art House Foundation, organization I've heard about, which really was dedicated at the time, and still is, to a kind of a shared exploration of faith and the arts. I have in front of me here one of the 3 volumes of Every Moment Holy. Next hour, we'll be talking about some things that aren't so holy, but this hour, we'll talk about Every Moment Holy, and it's a series that you need to know about. And so, first of all, Douglas, welcome to Point of View.
Thank you, Kerby. I'm happy to be here.
We're talking about this in the midst of all sorts of other activities, so maybe it's good to take a little bit of a break from some of the craziness that we will be talking about certainly a little bit later. But I thought one of the things that was very helpful about your book is early on you talk about the idea of liturgical rhythms. And on this program, we've talked about rhythms in the past. The fact that there are 24-hour cycles, there's 7-week cycles, there are 365-day cycles. I have a Sunday school class where we do everything on rhythm. I can tell you when we're going out to lunch. I can tell you when we're going to be having meetings, because we've said that maybe it's time to come back to some of those, if you will, circadian rhythms, some of those, if you will, astronomical rhythms, because with light bulbs and 24/7 kinds of broadcast, we forget about that. And one of the illustrations that you have in the book are different prayers that could be said at daybreak, at midday, and nightfall. Can you explain that for us?
Sure. There's an American writer named Annie Dillard that many of your listeners are probably familiar with, but she said something years ago to the effect of, the way we spend our moments is, of course, how we spend our lives. And I think that there are rhythms that serve either to shape us in ways that would conform our hearts more and more to the image of Christ, that would serve to reorient us as we move through our days and the various tasks and activities that we engage in and relationships. Those rhythms of what we choose to invest our moments and therefore our lives in do ultimately have the power to constructively shape us, so that our hearts become more and more inclined toward God and the story that He is telling across history, and the story that He's telling through each of our lives, and the weaving of those together. Or we can make choices to habitually engage in the rhythms of activities in our lives that will actually have a malforming, a misshaping effect on us over time, and that would move us away from having a sensitivity to God's presence and His purposes in our lives in all circumstances. So I think some of those prayers that you've referenced for morning, for midday, for evening, are ones that people can naturally incorporate into the existing rhythm of their days, in a way that carves out these moments to recognize that God is indeed active and present and engaged in each of our lives, and that even in this given day, in this given hour, in this given moment, that as we intentionally yield our hearts afresh to the workings of His Spirit, that He does not waste anything. He does not waste any opportunity. He will use it for His glory and for our good.
Let's see if we can take a break, and when we come back, I thought maybe we'll focus a little bit even on the foreword by Andrew Peterson, which gets us into the value of some of those prayers. And I might just mention that if you'd like to know more about, of course, this series, which has been out for some time, Every Moment Holy, or you'd like to know more about Douglas McKelvey, we have information about him. And I might also mention that as an individual that not only is a writer, but has also penned more than 350 lyrics that have been recorded by a variety of artists. He's located in Nashville, Tennessee. You can find out more about him, about these resources, and much more. But let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll talk a little bit more about how to even begin to think about these ideas of prayer and how to use those during this season or any season. We'll come back and talk about that right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
As December 2024 is winding down, many Americans begin to think about their finances. First, they're considering what donations they might make before the end of the year. Second, they're looking to 2025 and thinking about developing a financial plan. Unfortunately, many of us don't get past just thinking about developing a plan. So if you're eager to put together a sound financial plan, I recommend Forging Financial Freedom by Chad Hufford. He sets forth 7 wealth-building lessons he has learned. He argues that financial freedom is not a finish line. He reminds us that when retirement is your finish line, there is a tendency to put life on pause until you realize that achievement. He recommends that you get busy framing your future, which requires clarity and persistence. You should put your future together one piece at a time. You should also know when enough is enough by creating balance along your financial journey. Another of his recommendations is to farm your orchard. He explains that wealth is like an orchard. When a farmer plants an orchard, the trees are small and produce little fruit. Financial productivity is a long process. Unfortunately, some people are gambling when they should be farming. An important financial battle takes place in your mind. That is why he talks about winning the war in your mind. Quoting Hebrews 12:1, he encourages us to lay aside encumbrances. Often addition comes from subtraction. Finally, he reminds us that persistence beats perfection. The pressure of perfect can cause us to try to tackle too much, which is unsustainable. We need to develop healthy habits and a healthy lifestyle. Your financial future is in your hands. Get a copy of Forging Financial Freedom and get to work. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Loneliness, go to viewpoints.info/loneliness. That's viewpoints.info/loneliness. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again talking about the book Every Moment Holy. By the way, it's been out for many years, but now there's a whole series of them. And I thought for just a minute, going back to the original book, Douglas, it might be good to maybe pull in some of the material and some of the comments by Andrew Peterson, because he talks about a friend giving him a book, and he loves books, of course, and all that. But it was a book that was from a Scottish minister on a diary of private prayer. He said, growing up in a non-denominational church in the American South, a little bit suspicious of anything liturgical, but it really kind of gets us back to this whole idea of prayer. And what he says is that this has been very helpful in terms of his own prayer life and in the particular season he might find himself. So how can maybe people use some of these books that have been out for many years and this whole series to begin to re-energize and focus some of their prayer life and their Christian life?
Our hope from the beginning of the publishing of Volume 1, which happened in, I think, the fall of 2017, was not that a particular individual would end up using and incorporating every prayer in these books into their life. There are 100 prayers in Volume 1 on just a wide cross-section of moments, of experiences, activities, emotions, some sorts of menial things, some things that are celebratory and might only happen once a year, that type of thing. But our hope was that any given person or married couple or family or small group at church, would be able to find a number of the prayers in the book that would relate to things that they were already passionate about and already involved in their lives, or responsibilities that they already had, and that in that way incorporating these prayers into the rhythm of their days, their weeks, their months and years would become that very helpful shaping tool that we were talking about a few minutes ago, by virtue of the fact that it does become something that is this ongoing reminder. And for me, I really do like the word reorientation, because
Right.
I feel like in a given day, I need to be reminded multiple times that, oh, this actually isn't about me and the things that I'm so stressed and worried about. There is a God who loves me, who is involved, who is sovereign over these very things, and that, I believe in God, but there are moments when I realize, oh, I'm kind of living in the midst of a day as if I have to carry the weight of all of the burdens myself, as if the story really is about me rather than about God's redemptive work across history. So that was our hope from the beginning, was that in these prayers we would be offering the church and individuals these tools that would help them to begin to practice that rhythm of moment by moment, intentionally refocusing their awareness on the bigger story, on the presence of God with them.
As I've said, sometimes we end up being like functional atheists. We're not, but we sort of act that way. And I might just mention that we have whole sections on, of course, liturgies of labor and vocation and creation and recreation, blessing and celebration, which would be everything from a wedding to just other meaningful gatherings, petition and provision, sorrow and lament, as well as table blessings and much more. Of course, that's just volume 1 I'm looking at. Of course, there are multiple volumes. And it does seem to me that in some respects we have to recognize that that is something that we need to do. For our Muslim friends, well, that's the call to prayer. 5 times a day we want you to pray because we don't want you to forget about God. And as significant as that might be in the Muslim world, in the Christian world, we should on our own be able to be called back and reoriented to some of the things that are taking place. But let's come back, when you were talking about rhythm, to the one on creation. Because one of the things I've said, Douglas, is that I am always a big fan of Christian camping, because there is something unique that takes place when we take God's word into God's world. And I see so many life-changing decisions that have been made when people are out back in creation and they see the wonders of creation and they put that together with God's world, with God's word. And you've got a whole section on that. And so whether it's a sunset or stargazing or the first snow or the planting of flowers, those are very significant events which in this hustle and bustle of the 21st century, we sort of have lost. And in some respects, you're calling us back to that.
Well, and I'm grateful that you mentioned the idea of camping, because I think in that first volume, A Liturgy for Those Who Sleep in Tents, was one of my personal favorites. Just with each of the prayers that I wrote for these, for me, part of what I was trying to do was to say, okay, I believe, I subscribe to the belief that there is a God and that Jesus is his son, and that he is moving all of history toward this renewal, this redemption of all things, toward this new creation, where our tears will be wiped away, where our sorrows will be met and turned to eternal joy. And so if I believe that, then can I look at specific moments of life, like, you're changing the third diaper of the morning for your infant or your grandchild, in my case. Or, you're lighting the hearth fire for the first time this season, or you are camping. You're going out into the wilderness somewhere to sleep in a tent. Can we unpack those moments in such a way that we actually can draw clear lines based on what Scripture reveals, what God reveals in Scripture? Can we place that moment of changing a diaper on the timeline of that movement across history toward the redemption of all things? So, for me as a writer, that was one of the challenges in front of me as I tried to craft these liturgical prayers for these various moments, was to say, can I connect those dots between this abstract belief that I have and how that might actually be worked out in the moment as the Spirit of God engages with us in our everyday activities.
Let's see if we can take a break, but maybe when we come back, I'd like to get into that in more detail because, of course, we're talking about creation, but the next one is on blessing and celebration. And, of course, you would imagine that there's a prayer there for a wedding or a purposeful gathering, but a little bit later, there's one on the morning of a yard sale or the setting up of a Christmas tree. And what that sort of reminded me of the Flemish painters. You might remember some of those. I guess they were Flemish Baroque that would actually paint just normal scenes, people doing work, pouring water in a tavern, taking care of the day-to-day activities, which oftentimes we just see as routine, mundane, maybe even a little bit stifling in terms of not allowing creativity. And yet many of your prayers are, another one on the ritual of morning coffee or of the loss of electricity. When we come back, I want to talk about that because in some respects, maybe we can see the significance even in the repetitive, even in what might be considered to be mundane and quite boring and maybe even a little bit oppressive of the working of God in our lives as well. So it's all part of a conversation that is part of a series of volumes, Every Moment Holy. And we're talking with the author, Douglas Kaine McKelvey. And if you'd like to know more about him as we go to a break, you can see that we have a link to his website and also to these books. And if you'd like to know a little bit more, go to the website, pointofview.net. We'll take a break, come back with more right after this.
Many years ago, they began saying that we live in the information age. Well, today there is so much information coming at us from every direction. The hardest thing is to discern which issues are really important and how can I make a positive impact without wasting my time trying to figure out accurate information. Let me give you a suggestion to help with that. Visit pointofview.net. Look at the tabs across the top. Find the one named Viewpoints. Kerby Anderson and others on our team are constantly watching for news to identify those issues that you really need to know about. They boil things down in a brief summary, and then you can decide if it's something on which you want to learn more and get involved. Again, when you go to pointofview.net, click on Viewpoints, you'll see exactly what I mean. You'll see the issues that we are covering right now. And when you like what you see, I honestly think you will, you can slide on over, enter your email, and get them automatically sent to your inbox each day. That's it. Take a minute now, be informed. Pointofview.net, click on Viewpoints. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Douglas Kaine McKelvey, and we're talking about his series of books, Every Moment Holy. And I guess I stimulated something a minute ago. I jokingly say sometimes we should keep the microphones on during the break because my producer, Steve Miller, came in and we got talking about Flemish painters and imagination. Might hold up his booklet here. We, of course, send out a booklet each month to those of you who donate to the ministry. A lot of them are on issues, but this one on imagination. Actually, to be honest, this is sort of like the Cliff's Notes version of the longer essay that you can find on a Christian view of imagination on our website, pointofview.net. But I thought, Douglas, I'd come back to you because when we talk about imagination or we talk about the Flemish painters, the illustration I used or anything else was there is meaningful in the everyday activity, and that really kind of takes us back to this idea of every moment holy, doesn't it?
It does. I have become well. Let me put it this way: the prayers that early Celtic Christians would write and pray have become very meaningful to me because they had this tradition of crafting prayers for moments like covering the coals on the hearth fire at night, or a prayer for milking the cows in the morning. And, you know, there are points of theology that I would certainly differ with on some of the things that they expressed in those times, but there are some of those prayers that are just such beautiful reminders of the fact that God has been moving and at work for thousands of years, for all of time and history, and you know, across all of creation and space. And that, you know, those early believers in Ireland had discovered the value and the richness that could be brought into their lives by applying their imagination in such a way as to stimulate the remembrance of God's activity in their lives constantly. And, you know, for me, writers like to be original, but in this case, when I discovered that, this type of prayer that I was writing for these volumes of Every Moment Holy is not new. It existed more than 1,000 years ago. That all I'm doing is taking a practice that at one time the church found valuable, and I'm holding it up again and saying, is there value in our contemporary Western culture today? Is there value in this same practice that our brothers and sisters in a different part of the world long ago found valuable?
Sure. And it seems to me that in some respects we've needed it even more. Of course, you have prayers for those flooded by too much information. But back to the point we made it a minute ago, of course, you love the one about the prayers for an individual who sleeps in tents, or Steve was just talking about the one, a prayer for keeping of the bees. And that's all part of Volume 1, which is the new liturgies for daily life. But Volume 2 is on death, grief, and hope. But even in Volume 1, you have a whole section here for sorrow and lament. Now, we've done some programs on this idea of lament, and it does seem to me that that's another aspect. Of course, you then wrote another 100 prayers in Volume 2, and for people that want to know what is the other third volume, well, that's the one on the work of the people. But speak to that, if you might, for just a minute, because the time we oftentimes do pray is the midst of pain, grief, loss, and lament. And yet even there, I think we can maybe fill some of our wine skins with new wine. Can you help us with that?
As I was nearing the completion of Volume 1, I had a list of topics that I hoped to get to, but pretty quickly I realized that there just wasn't going to be time and that I didn't have even the emotional bandwidth for some of the weighty topics that I had hoped would be in Volume 1. But the prayer that I most felt was missing from Volume 1 that I wished was in there after it was published was a prayer for those who are in the immediate experience of grief,
right,
of having just recently lost someone that they love. And so I set about to write that prayer thinking, well, this is one that's really important. It's needed. And I didn't know at that point if there would ever be a Volume 2 of Every Moment Holy, but I thought we can at least put this on the website, the Every Moment Holy website, and offer it as a free download for people who might be served by that. So I started working on that, and it just expanded and expanded. There were so many facets that seemed important to address when considering a prayer that would rightly articulate what might be on the heart of someone experiencing that kind of grief. So it split, that one prayer split into a half dozen prayers, and then several of those split into 2 or 3 prayers, because there were just so many facets that needed to be addressed. And pretty soon I called the publisher and said, I think we have to do a whole book just on prayers related to grief and, the hope that we have even in the midst of that, and prayers for those who are in a position where they've learned that maybe they have 6 months to live, and what does it mean for a follower of Jesus to navigate that process, that journey of following Christ even into and through the valley of the shadow? And are there prayers that could be crafted that could comfort those people? And so one of the main things that I gained personally from the 2 years I spent writing those prayers of death, grief, and hope for Volume 2 was this conviction of how essential it is in our following of Jesus that we learn to do what he did, which is to be a person of sorrows, acquainted with grief, to mourn with those who mourn and rejoice with those who rejoice, to be able to hold the joy that we have in our hope in Christ at the same time that we fully experience the sorrow and the grief of what it means to live in a broken world. So that topic began to work itself into and through so many of the prayers that I was writing, because I found that, yes, in the midst of sorrow, our hope does hold. Christ is real. His promises are true. The eternal hope that he gives us is great, and it leavens the whole lump of dough, as it were. But we also, in Christ, have the model of the one who wept at the tomb of Lazarus, even knowing that he would resurrect him. But I think he understood what it was to be human and to face that kind of loss and the grief that comes with it. And so I think we find in Christ that perfect marriage of one who can hold fully the weight of sorrow and the great joy of the hope that is before us. And one does not negate the other. It doesn't deny the other. That the hope actually works backwards, as C.S. Lewis said, and becomes that one day in hindsight, when we look back, we will see that joy was already beginning to permeate the loss and the sorrow. So, yeah, I appreciate you appreciate you highlighting that topic, because I think it did become one of the most important and essential themes of Volume 2, that marriage of sorrow and joy.
I think, again, I might just also commend you on the fact that you talk about the anniversary of loss and inconsolable homesickness and facing the slow loss of memory, the long goodbye, and so many different aspects of loss and grief that are all part of that Volume 1, which then are developed even more so in Volume 2. Let's take a break. When we come back, maybe talk just a few more minutes about, for practicing the presence of God, some of those liturgies of the moment. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
In fact, for a few more minutes, talking about Every Moment Holy, you can go to the website, everymomentholy.com, and there are all sorts of downloads. There's prints. There are various formats, including the most recent one in a pocket edition. If you'd like to get something for a gift for Christmas or for yourself, those are all available at the website, pointofview.net, or you can go directly to everymomentholy.com. But I thought for just a few more minutes, Douglas, we might talk about a whole section on practicing the presence of God. Now, that takes us back to Brother Lawrence, but you've got sections on upon seeing a beautiful person, tasting pleasurable food, maybe just thinking about another person, maybe sighting a flower in bloom, all sorts of other ideas. But it does seem to me that that gets us back to this idea of being mindful of the fact that we live in a world created by God, and sometimes we tend to go about our daily life and forget about God. And so this is an attempt to begin to practice the presence of God.
That was definitely the hope in which those were written. And the idea with those shorter momentary prayers was to have a section in each one of the 3 volumes so far that would include prayers that are short enough that they could be easily memorized, just recognizing that a person is not always going to have a book with them as they're going about their day. But that some of these key prayers would be ones that they could carry with them in their memory and could recite. And one of those that I think I'm most fond of is the one for waiting in line. So, when you're waiting in line at the DMV and are tempted to become frustrated and maybe express that in your countenance, if not in your actual words or actions. The idea was here's that can actually be a moment to reorient your heart and mind toward God. And
right.
So.
Well, another one that you had in there was the sound of sirens. How many of us over the years, as we've come upon an accident, maybe we've had traffic and all of a sudden we see, it was a horrible accident, or we're just sitting alone and we hear the sirens and the wail of sirens, as you say, as an anthem of our brokenness, reminding us that fear and tragedy, pain and crime yet plague a creation groaning for its redemption. Just great turns of phrases, but again, just an idea that sometimes those momentary opportunities to pray come upon us with some regularity, don't they?
They do. Yeah. I don't know what else to say about that, but
well, that's
I certainly agree with you.
Yes, and again, I've been with people, and I'm sure you've done it as well, where we come upon an accident, we just think about prayer, and I never even thought that someone would actually put together a prayer in that regard. I love your one about waiting in line and all the rest. But in the few minutes we have left, I thought for just a minute we might talk about how to actually use these resources, because you have a number of volumes, and again, we'll just real quickly mention that the one we have been talking about primarily is Volume 1 on daily life, but then Volume 2 I think would be so helpful to anybody right now during this season who is experiencing loss, feeling loneliness, grief, on death, grief, and hope. And then the most recent one on the work of the people, which again, many of these are available in hardcover, they're available in softcover, they're available in a number of different ways to begin to help people think through what they might do in terms of having a daily prayer life. But talk, if you might, for just a minute on how we can use these resources. Some of those are ones that I would set on my desk or on a coffee table. Others are small enough that they could be in my pocket. And so you've probably, over these many years now, at least 7 years of experience, I've had stories about how people have used them in their lives, and maybe give us some direction on how we can use it in our lives.
Sure. There are many stories that people have either told to me or to the publisher about the ways that certain prayers have become meaningful in their lives. I think the prayer for the ritual of morning coffee that you mentioned is perhaps the most utilized prayer. And it's a fairly short one. I think there are people who have memorized that one, but it's also one that we knew we should make available as an art print. Ned Bustard is just the brilliant line-a-cut printmaker artist who has illustrated these books, and he has a wonderful illustration for that. So we we made an art print available with the prayer and that illustration on it. And a lot of people have purchased that to hang on the wall over the little table in the kitchen nook where they have their coffee every morning.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that there really has not been one kind of consistent way that people use the books that have emerged. It really has been a process people have their own unique relationship to the book and to certain prayers in it,
of course,
that they find are the ones that are most helpful and meaningful to them. We've just come through the Thanksgiving season and headed toward Christmas, and I've seen each year around that time, I see people beginning to post videos of they and their family or friends who are gathered reciting a liturgy for feasting with friends.
Right.
That one has become a meaningful part of the year, and particularly holiday celebrations for people, just for the way that it sets the tone for the gathering and for the conversations that follow, and that it reminds everyone of the deeper meanings of what they're celebrating and why. I spoke to a woman a few weeks ago in England, where I've been for a couple of months, who said, I have taken to praying the liturgy for nightfall every evening. And she said it doesn't really work so well with my schedule and kids and so forth to try to fit in the liturgy for daybreak and the liturgy for midday. But she said the one for nightfall has become a daily part of the rhythm of her life.
Very good.
So, yeah, I think it's more than being able to say, well, here are the best ways to use it. I would say, look through the table of content at the topics, and there will probably be some of those topics that will just jump out at you as, right. Oh, that would make sense in the context of my life.
Yep. Use what works best for you. Well, Douglas, I appreciate you writing those books. I thank you for giving us an hour today. And again, let me wish you a Merry Christmas.
Thank you, Kerby. Merry Christmas to you as well.
Let's, if we can, take a break. And when we come back, we have lots of topics to get in. It is a very busy news cycle. And sometimes, as we said, December is a time where we can pause and reflect. Not exactly this time. So we'll get into some of the news items. And if we don't cover them all, well, we've got all week to begin to focus on some of that as well. All this information available to you at the website, pointofview.net. You might notice we've posted a new video for you to watch. And, of course, I've got a new, Viewpoints commentary. So all of that available at the website, pointofview.net. Let's take a break. Let's get back into the news cycle right after this.
It almost seems like we live in a different world from many people in positions of authority. They say men can be women and women men. People are prosecuted differently or not at all, depending on their politics. Criminals are more valued and rewarded than law-abiding citizens. It's so overwhelming, so demoralizing. You feel like giving up, but we can't. We shouldn't. We must not. As Winston Churchill said to Britain in the darkest days of World War II, never give in, never give in, never, 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 never yield to force, never yield to the apparently overwhelming might of the enemy. And that's what we say to you today. This is not a time to give in, but to step up and join Point of View in providing clarity in the chaos. We can't do it alone, but together, with God's help, we will overcome the darkness. Invest in biblical clarity today at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I do appreciate Point of View and what you folks are doing. You really are doing a great job to educate and to help Christian folks do a better job to honor Christ in all that we do.
My husband and I are your supporters. We just really appreciate the show and the people you bring on.
I just want to commend you guys on your program. I love listening to you. It's a blessing. Been listening to you for several years. Your program has helped my family see current events and elections and politics through the eyes and the principles of Scripture. And that's been enlightening, and we're trying to pass that on to others.
I want to say, first of all, that I really enjoyed the Millennial Roundtable, and I love the program altogether. I think Kerby is great, and I really appreciate all of y'all, all that y'all do, and the truth that y'all put out.
Hey, great show. Love all your comments and what you're talking about.
Thanks again for what you do.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today, we're going to spend some time talking about what's going on in Syria. And I might just mention that if you go to our website, you're going to find a couple of articles, one from National Review, one from Wall Street Journal. I'm going to share some others that we haven't posted, but maybe as the week unfolds, we'll get into that in more detail. Might also mention, as you go to the website, my Viewpoints commentary, as I mentioned just last hour, is new, of course, and it's about financial freedom. We may talk about it a little bit later. We have a new video, the interview I did this time last week with Dr. Jack Graham on his book, The Jesus Book. And, of course, you can also click on Pray for America. Sign up for that. We have the Point of View highlights on Spotify that our own Megan puts together, and you will find some great material there as well. So lots of resources there. But yesterday I was about ready to speak in my Sunday school class. Somebody pulled me aside and said, "Are you going to talk about Syria?" I said, well, I really wasn't planning on it. What do we know so far? And I thought I did make a brief statement, but let's get into this in some detail, because maybe you're trying to figure out what that means. And if you are certainly maybe only listening to Point of View and are really aware of what has happened, over the weekend, you've had Syrian rebel forces that have seized control of Syria, of the capital, Damascus. Now, that has forced the longtime dictator, President Bashar al-Assad, into exile in Russia. This has, of course, been a civil war that has been ongoing since 2011. We were talking last hour here with Douglas about his first book in 2017, which was like 7 years ago. But here we talk about something that is almost 15 years old. It's amazing that this has been going on for some time. Thousands, of course, have been killed. Half of the population in Syria has been displaced, and on and on. So we'll get into those details. But let's, if we can, work through a few of the articles that I've made available to you. And one comes from the editors of National Review, who said, in a stunning turn of events, Bashar al-Assad's Syrian regime has collapsed. As rebel groups celebrated in the streets of Damascus and tore down large posters of his face, the dictator fled the country. Rebel leaders declared Syria free of the tyrant, and the Prime Minister Mohammed Ghazali al-Jalari called for free elections. We'll see how far that goes, but that is what's going on. And, of course, there's been this deadlocked civil war since I mentioned 2011. Now, they go on to say that the fall of Assad marks the end not only of his leadership, but of more than 50 years of brutal rule by his family, which dates all the way back to 1971, when his father, Hafez al-Assad, seized control of Syria, and then continued on when Bashar al-Assad took over in the year 2000. This has been, of course, a savage rule at home, and the close allies of Syria have been Russia and Iran. One of the reasons why they have said maybe this is a victory for, or at least an opening or possibility for the United States. I'm going to kind of set that aside in a minute, but certainly has been a defeat for Russia and Iran. So at this point, it's difficult to know what to expect. you think? Assad was a tyrant, but those fighting Assad were not one monolithic freedom-seeking rebel group. The rebels are a collection of a number of rebel groups with different grievances against the regime, and this includes even jihadis. Those would be jihadi terrorist groups and Muslim groups of that sort. One of those would be the insurgent leader Abu Muhammad al-Golani, who formerly fought for al-Qaeda in Iraq and has been designated a terrorist by the United States government. There will always be the realist argument that as bad as Assad was, we have no idea what will happen without him in control, with the biggest fear that the Islamic groups could seize power in different areas of Syria and gain access to some of those abandoned weapons, which include a number of the chemical weapons which Assad, as you might know, has used against his own people. So there's a lot of if in terms of what this might mean. Let me now go to the second article, which we've posted for you to read if you would want to do so, which comes from the editors of the Wall Street Journal. The weekend collapse, they say, at long last of the Assad family regime in Syria is no cause for mourning unless you're leaders in Russia and Iran. The fall creates risks, but also opportunities for a better Syria and a more stable Middle East. Maybe. I got my doubts, but let's see where we go. The elder Assad took power in the coup in 2070, as I mentioned, 271 took over, and really ran the regime like a mafia group. The older brother was supposed to succeed. His father died in a car accident. So the younger son, trained as an ophthalmologist, became the unlikely heir, but still was one of the bloody leaders, one of the bloodiest ophthalmologists, as somebody said, we've ever had in power. Incredibly, though, let's go back and give us a little bit of history. It was President Barack Obama who invited Russia to help end the civil war that had been taking place there in Syria. And Vladimir Putin was quite willing to oblige and joined with Iran to prop up, of course, Assad, elbowing, in a sense, the United States out and establishing then now a Russian air base and a long-desired naval base in the Mediterranean. So this misjudgment, according to the editors of the Wall Street Journal, helped Iran expand its axis of resistance from Tehran to Beirut. It also reversed the strategic triumph achieved under, at that time, President Richard Nixon and the Secretary of State Henry Kissinger in the 1970s of trying to minimize the influence of the Soviet Union in the Middle East. But, of course, as they also point out, this fall of the Assad government is a defeat for both Russia and Iran. And so none of this defeat is a result of, say, the foreign policy under the current president, that would be Joe Biden, like Barack Obama. This Middle East priority has been appeasing Iran, which, if you, of course, can document, really culminated in the October 7th massacre by Hamas of many Israeli citizens, and of course has been led by Iran and its proxies to imagine they had Israel on the run. But so far what has happened is Israel has turned the tables, first by diminishing Hamas in Gaza, then by eliminating some of the leadership of Hezbollah to the north and demonstrating that it can strike even heavily defended targets in Iran. And so, of course, what you've had up until right now is President Biden has been kind of a caretaker president, but we'll now see if indeed by January 20th, President Donald Trump maybe does something a little bit different. He would like, of course, to stay out of the conflict, but there's still U.S. interest in Syria, so we'll see what that might indeed take place. So when we come back from the break, I want to suggest to you some scenarios. These come from our good friend Jim Dennison, because what is going to unfold in Syria will affect Israel and ultimately affect the United States. We'll come back with more right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
As December 2024 is winding down, many Americans begin to think about their finances. First, they're considering what donations they might make before the end of the year. Second, they're looking to 2025 and thinking about developing a financial plan. Unfortunately, many of us don't get past just thinking about developing a plan. So if you're eager to put together a sound financial plan, I recommend Forging Financial Freedom by Chad Hufford. He sets forth 7 wealth-building lessons he has learned. He argues that financial freedom is not a finish line. He reminds us that when retirement is your finish line, there is a tendency to put life on pause until you realize that achievement. He recommends that you get busy framing your future, which requires clarity and persistence. You should put your future together one piece at a time. You should also know when enough is enough by creating balance along your financial journey. Another of his recommendations is to farm your orchard. He explains that wealth is like an orchard. When a farmer plants an orchard, the trees are small and produce little fruit. Financial productivity is a long process. Unfortunately, some people are gambling when they should be farming. An important financial battle takes place in your mind. That is why he talks about winning the war in your mind. Quoting Hebrews 12:1, he encourages us to lay aside encumbrances. Often addition comes from subtraction. Finally, he reminds us that persistence beats perfection. The pressure of perfect can cause us to try to tackle too much, which is unsustainable. We need to develop healthy habits and a healthy lifestyle. Your financial future is in your hands. Get a copy of Forging Financial Freedom and get to work. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Loneliness, go to viewpoints.info/loneliness. That's viewpoints.info/loneliness. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Right, for a few more minutes to go and to spend just a little bit more time talking about Syria. It will be in the news. And again, I recognize that for some of us, it's a small country on the other side of the world. We might say, why should we be concerned? Well, if you're concerned about Middle East policy, if you're concerned about Israel, even concerned about U.S. interests, there are some significant reasons to pay attention to that. And that's really going to be the question that incoming President Donald Trump will have to address. Right now, I think it's fair to say that Joe Biden is sort of a caretaker president. He was maybe briefed on this, but there's no action I think he will take, although he surprised us more than once, so we'll see how that unfolds. But what about the possibility of this becoming another jihadist state? We don't need another place in the world that becomes favorable to terrorists. We've faced that before with Iran, Iraq, certainly Afghanistan, and Pakistan and others. And so there is certainly the possibility that the United States, which has a small military base in Syria, could in some way prevent the revival of another Islamic state. Remember, ISIS took over Iraq, and that was what came to be known as ISIS. You have thousands of ISIS fighters and families that are really detained by Kurdish forces in Syria, but what would happen if they take over? And of course, there's another issue as well, and that is the United States wants to defend allies. Of course, the obvious one is Israel, but let's talk about another one, Jordan. Jordan could become a renewed target for some kind of jihadist revolt. Israel, of course, will also be wary, they say, of radical intentions, and on the weekend bombed a chemical plant used for weapons in Syria, lest it fall into the hands of the new regime. The Kurds, who control parts of northern Syria, are friendly to U.S. interests and are a target for Turkey's Islamic leader, Erdogan. So there's just a lot going on there in Syria. But I thought for just a minute, before we move on to other topics, of which there are many, our good friend Jim Dennison has actually tried to set forth a number of scenarios and reminds us, of course, this civil war has been going on since 2011. And even more recently, the various rebel forces launched an assault on Aleppo, which is in Syria, which is the second largest city, and now has actually entered in Damascus and driven Assad from power. As I mentioned before, you have Abu Muhammad al-Golani, who is a former al-Qaeda chief and is an individual that is part of that rebel group. So where this goes, I think, brings us down to four scenarios. Three which aren't very good, and a fourth one which I'd like to believe, but maybe is less likely, but certainly would be the best scenario. So the first three scenarios he talks about, scenario A is where Israel determines that Iran is responding to the fall of Assad and begins to it's accelerating its quest for nuclear weapons. Russia, China, and North Korea then defend Iran by striking back at Israel. The U.S., of course, forced to come to the aid of Israel, and then you have American forces that are attacked. NATO fulfills its treaty obligations, and what we do is we are on the pathway to World War III. Let's hope and pray that scenario number A does not take place. Jim Dennison talks about then scenario B. That's where rebels who are now controlling Syria comprise an existential threat against Israel, and that draws the United States and the West into the conflict as well. And so you've already seen the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu talking about the collapse of the Assad regime as a historic day in the Middle East, one that offers great opportunity, but also is fraught with significant dangers. And those dangers exist because the rebels, some which are nationalist, others which are Islamicists, all are gathered together. And as a result, that could be a situation in which right now Israel has taken control of a buffer zone on the Syrian border as a defensive position. You've got to recognize, if you ever travel to Israel, if you are in the Golan Heights, you can look into Syria. Many of you probably remember that when the Apostle Paul, back then known as Saul, was traveling on the way to what? Damascus, which is, of course, where Syria is. He had, of course, a spiritual experience, became a believer, a Christian. And so in some respects, it's a reminder again of how close Israel is to Syria. As a matter of fact, one of the gates in the old city of Jerusalem is called what? The Damascus Gate, because that would be the direction you would go if you go to Damascus. So in this one, whether again there would be involvement of the United States, of Russia, of China, of Iran, I mean, again, you can see that that's not necessarily a pleasant scenario either. It may not be World War III, but it isn't necessarily one that is going to bring about any kind of peace and stability in the Middle East. So I've given you scenario A, scenario B. What about scenario C? This is in which the rebels control what's going on in Syria, and they actually do align with the terrorist groups in that area. Then U.S. forces might have to conduct some kind of airstrikes and those kinds of things. And so, again, the question being raised, if the fall of Assad regime leads to renewed terrorist activity in Syria, that could lead, of course, to either scenario A or B that we've talked about. So at this point, you're saying, well, there are any good scenarios? And that's the one that he refers to as scenario D, that none of this takes place. The rebels seek to govern Syria in a responsible manner and decide to leave Israel in peace. Possible, if for no other reason than Israel poses such a threat to the rebels. That Iran sees the folly of building a nuclear threat against Israel and doesn't go any further down that road. That Russia, already embroiled in a battle in Ukraine, decides to kind of stay out of the conflict. Possible. And Israel is able to conclude its conflict in its military action against Hamas and tries to create some kind of stable relationship with its Palestinian neighbors. It's possible, maybe not as likely as we'd like it to be, but you do have an incoming President, Donald Trump, who would like to avoid any kind of military action in the Middle East. You have an incoming ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee, who might bring it about. But if nothing else, again, we should pray for the peace of Jerusalem and also recognize that in Matthew 24, Jesus warned that there would be wars and rumors of wars until the Lord returns. So these are the scenarios that are unfolding, and over the next few weeks and months, we'll probably be looking at Syria. But what unfolded over the weekend is certainly causing people in the State Department, in the Defense Department, to begin to rethink what kinds of actions we might take, especially with an incoming President, Donald Trump. Just before I take a break, let me mention a couple of real quick items. The first is, you've heard me mention before, Daniel Penny. He was that Marine veteran who actually was trying to subdue an individual, Jordan Neely, on a subway, and then was actually accused of what would be considered negligent homicide. And today, a jury reached a unanimous verdict on count 2 of the indictment, involuntary manslaughter, and so as a result, he was found innocent. At that point, Jordan Neely's father, who's been estranged from his son, nevertheless yelled out in protest. Kind of hard to tell what those words are, and I can't repeat them on the air, even if I did. Also, you have from the brother and sister from Black Lives Matter referring to this as a racist, using a bad word, country. And, of course, there's also going to be a lawsuit, a criminal suit against him. So his liability is still there, but it's a really sad commentary indeed. And when we come back from the break, real briefly, it does seem like we have been able to actually can arrest, and I'm pretty sure going to be easy to convict, the individual who is responsible for the murder of the United Healthcare CEO Brian Thompson outside of a Manhattan hotel. I'll come back and explain why it's pretty obvious that this is the individual who actually indeed did shoot this individual and kill him. And the evidence is so incredible that I think unless you are dealing with one of the most remarkable pieces of circumstantial evidence, I think we have actually indeed caught the individual who tried to and then was successful in murdering the CEO of United Healthcare. Let's take a break. We have a lot of other things to cover. We'll do that right after these important messages.
At Point of View, we believe there is power in prayer. And that is why we have relaunched our Pray for America campaign, a series of weekly emails to unite Americans in prayer for our nation. Imagine if hundreds of thousands of Americans started praying intentionally together on a weekly basis. You can help make that a reality by subscribing to our Pray for America emails. Just go to pointofview.net and click on the Pray for America banner that's right there on the homepage. Each week you'll receive a brief news update, a specific prayer guide, and a free resource to equip you in further action. We encourage you to not only pray with us each week, but to share these prayers and the resources with others in your life. Join the movement today. Visit pointofview.net and click on the banner Pray for America right there at the top. That's pointofview.net. Let's pray together for God to make a difference in our land. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, I might just mention, as I think I said just a minute ago, that we have a new video and an interview that I did this time last week with Dr. Jack Graham on his book, The Jesus Book. It's about 36 minutes. By taking out some of the breaks and everything like that, you can watch that, and it's on the website, pointofview.net, and you're free to watch it or maybe even provide a link so that others can learn about it as well. One of the things we talked about with Jack Graham is the fact that the interest in the Bible has increased. And that comes to one of our other articles we've posted today on our website. It comes from our good friend, Dr. Jerry Newcomb. Bible sales are increasing. He says the good book is the world's most widely distributed book. It's also the world's bestseller. And now sales of the Judeo-Christian scriptures are rising. He says the Wall Street Journal reports on a recent uptick in sales. The headline declares sales of Bibles are booming, fueled by first-time buyers and new versions. The subtitle notes publishers attribute a 22% jump in Bible sales this year to rising anxiety, a search for hope, or highly focused marketing and designs. A lot of reasons for that, but nevertheless, the point that Jerry Newcomb is making is this is a significant trend. The Bible has played a key role in our life as our nation. It then gives us some quotes, which you might want to use. You might want to post this on your website that you might have, or Facebook page, or maybe you have a Twitter post on X, whatever it might be. But first of all, he quotes from a good friend, Dr. Erwin Lutzer, longtime pastor of Moody Church and best-selling author, who penned these words in his book, Exploding, the myths that could destroy America. Erwin Lutzer said, an atheist's logic tells him that he is of no value than a baboon or a grain of sand, yet his life contradicts such a conclusion. He may provide for his wife and his family, and if you were to steal his car, he would want you to be punished. All of this because he is created in the image of God. We are still coasting on the values derived from our rich Judeo-Christian heritage. Matter of fact, Jerry Newcomb goes on to say, it's hard to live without purpose, but life does have meaning, and we find that purpose in the pages of Holy Scripture. Quotes from Augustine in his book, The Confessions. A little bit later, he said, but if life is merely an accidental product of time, matter, and chance, then life has no design. It has no real meaning. And then in this case, quotes from Huxley, Aldous Huxley, who basically, if I can summarize his quote, basically was saying that we wanted life to have no meaning because then it would allow us to be involved sexually without any restraint. But Jerry Newcomb brings us back to this question. Ultimately, the question is, what is the purpose of life? It can only be answered by the author of life, God himself. Indeed, if there's a God, life has a purpose, and he's revealed that in his Bible and in his word. And then he gives us some historical quotes just before we wind down this section here. Let me give you a few. The Pilgrims, for example, in their Mayflower Compact of 1620, talked about their voyage was for the glory of God and for the advancement of the Christian faith. He quotes from President John Adams, one of our nation's founders, second president, first vice president, who said, I've made it a practice every year for several years to read through the Bible. He then quotes from Ulysses S. Grant, the 18th president of the United States, who declared, hold fast to the Bible as the anchor of your liberty. Write its precepts in your hearts and practice them in your lives. He then goes on to quote from Theodore Roosevelt, 26th president of the United States, who observed, if a man is not familiar with the Bible, he has suffered the loss which he has better make it all possible haste to correct. And finally, he quotes from Ronald Reagan, 40th President of the United States, said of Scriptures, it is my firm belief that the enduring values presented in its pages have a great meaning for each of us and our nation. The Bible can touch our hearts, order our minds, and refresh our souls. So again, this article that we have posted here by Jerry Newcomb, as well as the video, which is available today at the website pointofview.net, is an interview we did with Jack Graham on the Jesus book. He spends some time, of course, talking about the significance of the Bible, the trustworthiness of the Bible, kind of the historical aspect of the Bible, and all of that is available on the website at pointofview.net. So I hope you'll take the time to put it to good use. Real quickly, let me just mention that indeed it looks like we have found the individual who killed Brian Thompson. Some people said assassinated, and I was listening to a talk show host that says, when is a murder considered an assassination? We certainly consider that when you try to kill a political figure, that's called an assassination. Would we also call it an assassination when you try to kill a CAO? Maybe, and we'll have to see whether or not that's a good use of the term. But nevertheless, we now are pretty sure this is the killer because we know that he took a bus from New York to Altoona, Pennsylvania, and that's about 280 miles from New York City. He was found with a gun, a silencer, false identification cards similar to those believed to have been used by the killer. And so those seem pretty significant. The man who was detained at a McDonald's showed the police the same fake New Jersey identification that the man who was believed to be the gunman presented when he checked into a hostel in Upper West Side of Manhattan on November 24th. He also arrived on a Greyhound bus, and again, it is believed to be the very same Greyhound bus that was indeed taken from New York City. And then also, they, of course, have the handwritten manifesto, which actually is one that is criticizing health care companies for putting profits above care. And so I'd say I think we've got everything we need to know that he's the killer, and I suspect we will have a fairly quick conviction. Probably will actually plead out guilty because of what he has done. It also sets aside, can I say real quickly, some of these really bizarre things that were said on the air. You've heard me many times say, I'd rather wait and be right than be the first out and be wrong. And there were people coming up with the idea that this was justified because this individual was denied some kind of health care, or that this was actually a hit that was contracted by the CEO who did not want to testify, so wanted to be killed so he didn't have to testify against, just a variety of other things that were proposed at the time, all of which I suspect we now know will be false. And as a result, will illustrate again what a dangerous world that we live in when we've talked about the need to protect Donald Trump and J.D. Vance and maybe even some of the other individuals that are going to be nominees for the Trump administration, whether it's certainly Kash Patel or Pete Hegseth or maybe even Robert F. Kennedy or Tulsi Gabbard or people like that. And when we come back from the break, I do want to, for just a few minutes, read a piece from Victor Davis Hanson, which he says what Trump nominees will actually not do, which I thought was a really good piece in that regard. But just before we take a break and we get back into some of the issues in the news, I thought since it was appropriate that this weekend we had the reopening of Notre Dame, that one of the pieces I was going to post was the fact that here you have such a contrast in France between, again, reopening for the first time since the fire April 2019. The architects at the time wanted to put a modern kind of glass and steel cover on this medieval cathedral. I'm grateful that they decided to reject that and instead try to restore this with timeless beauty and something that really has inspired people for decades and centuries. But what a contrast, too, between this iconic Gothic ceiling that has now been rebuilt and the cultural decay that was on full view and full display during the 2024 Olympics. Remember when you had that opening ceremony that openly mocked Christianity and glamorized lust and all the rest? If nothing else, I think it was a great antithesis to the secularism, the hedonistic display, and if nothing else, just a reminder that, yes, there are still great icons of history and of beauty, and restoring Notre Dame back to its beauty and to its grandeur, I think was something that we haven't really mentioned, but was worth mentioning since it took place over the weekend. along with so many other things we're talking about here today on Point of View. Let's take a break, though. What about these nominees, these Trump nominees? I have some comments about that before we end today, right after these important messages.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, one of the pieces by Victor Davis Hanson. You just got to love the way he writes some of this, and that is he's pointing out that many of these nominees are controversial. Got it. But I think what was so interesting, how he put this together, is he said, let's just look at 4 of these nominees. And the first of those is the FBI director nominee, Kash Patel. And he gives us 7 things that this particular Trump nominee will not do. Number 1, he will not serially lie under oath to federal investigators, as did the interim FBI director, Andrew McCabe, a current critic of course, Kash Patel. Number 2, he will not forge an FBI court affidavit, as did convicted felon and agency lawyer Kevin Kleinsmith. Number 3, he will not claim amnesia 245 times under congressional oath to evade embarrassing admissions, as did the former director James Comey. Number 4, he will not partner with a foreign national to collect dirt and subvert a presidential campaign, as the FBI did with Christopher Steele in 2016. Number 5, he will not use the FBI to draft social media to suppress news unfavorable to a presidential candidate on the eve of an election. Number 6, he will not have suppressed FBI knowledge that Hunter Biden's laptop was genuine to allow the lie to spread that it was Russian disinformation on the eve of the 2020 election. And number 7, he will not raid the home of an ex-president with SWAT teams, surveil Catholics, monitor parents at school board meetings, or go after pro-life peaceful protesters. So there's at least 7 things that a possible new FBI director, Kash Patel, will not do, which, as you're figuring out, were done under the Biden administration. Well, then he goes on to say there's another controversial nominee, and that would be the decorated combat veteran Pete Hegseth. And again, he comes up with 8 things that Pete Hegseth will not do. Number 1, he will not go AWOL without notifying the president of a serious medical procedure, as did the current Secretary Lloyd Austin. Number 2, he won't install race and gender criteria for promotion and mandate diversity, equity, and inclusion training. Number 3, he won't insinuate falsely that cabals of white supremacists have infiltrated the military only to alienate that entire demographic and thus ensure the Pentagon came up with 4,000 recruits short. Number 4, he won't oversee the scramble from Kabul that saw $50 billion in U.S. equipment abandoned to Taliban terrorists. Number 5, he won't watch passively as a Chinese spy balloon traverses the continental United States for a week. Number 6, he won't allow the chairman of the Joint Chiefs to promise his Chinese communist counterpart that the People's Liberation Army would be the first to be informed if the President of the United States was going to issue a dangerous order. Number 7, he wouldn't rotate into the Pentagon from a defense contract border ship and then leave office to rotate back there to leverage procurement decisions. And number 8, he won't oversee the Pentagon's serial flunking of fiscal audits. I think you can kind of get the idea. Last 2, Robert Kennedy, a nominee for Health and Human Services, comes up with 4 of those. Number 1, Robert F. Kennedy will not oversee his agency circumventing U.S. law by transferring money to Communist China to help it produce lethal gain-of-function viruses of the COVID-19 sort, in the manner of Dr. Fauci. Number 2, he won't organize scientists to go after critics of mandatory masking and defame them. Number 3, he won't give pharmaceutical companies near lifetime exemptions from legal jeopardy for rushing into the production of mRNA vaccines not traditionally vetted or tested. And number 4, he won't leave office to monetize his health and human services expertise and thus make millions from pharmaceutical companies. And one last controversial nominee would be Tulsi Gabbard, nominee for the Director of National Intelligence. And he says Tulsi Gabbard has not joined the 51 former U.S. intelligence authorities to lie on the eve of the 2020 election that the Hunter Biden laptop had all the hallmarks of a Russian information disinformation operation. Tulsi Gabbard has not lied under congressional oath like the former Director of National Intelligence James Clapper, who claimed he only gave the least untruthful answer in congressional testimony. Tulsi Gabbard also has not encouraged the FBI to monitor a presidential campaign in efforts to discredit it in the manner of the former CIA Director John Brennan, who lied not once but twice under oath. And Tulsi Gabbard has not failed to foresee the American meltdown in Kabul, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the Hamas terrorist attacks on Israel, or the Houthis takeover of the Red Sea. The point he's making, I think you can kind of figure it out by now, is if you're going to be critical of the incoming nominees, recognize what the previous people that have held those positions have said and done. And the old phrase, if you're living in a glass house, you probably don't want to be throwing rocks. And so, again, if you'd like to read it in its entirety, and I summarized it quickly, Victor Davis Hanson did a really good job of reminding us of why there is such a controversy right now, because some of these nominees want to clean up the mess that was created over the last 4 years. But my last piece is by Beckett Adams. He calls it the 6 stages of grief. Now, if you're familiar with the whole idea of death and dying, I wrote a book back 40 decades ago on death and dying. It's denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. But he says for some of the, at least Democrats out there, there's been a 5th and then now a 6th stage of grief. It's called delusion. And they've talked about how people have tried to defend Joe Biden's pardon of his son, Hunter Biden. And what they've been doing, according to Beckett Adams, in this delusion, is trying to just rewrite history. I'll just end with 2 of those examples. The first is one of the co-hosts in CBS's View is Ana Navarro, in which she said, you can't argue that Joe Biden is doing anything that previous presidents have not done. She says, Woodrow Wilson pardoned his brother-in-law, Hunter DeButts. I can't even say this with a straight face. So tell me how Joe Biden is setting a precedent. And, of course, if you've never heard of that incident, it's because it never happened. There is no Hunter DeButts. If you listen to this for a second, you recognize this almost has got to be a joke. Woodrow Wilson never pardoned his brother-in-law. It's a pure fabrication. Where did she get that? It turns out she got that from ChatGPT. Those AI bots, sometimes they make some real mistakes, and sometimes they hallucinate non-existent events. And so she tried to defend it by saying, well, I got it from AI, so take it up with AI. No, it's not historically accurate. And then the other one was, of course, Charles Pierce. He's a political columnist, and he actually has written this 1,000-word story, but the title is, A President Shouldn't Pardon His Son. Hello, anybody remember Neil Bush? I can't again say that with a straight face, because Neil Bush was not the son of George Herbert Walker Bush. George Herbert Walker Bush's son was what? George W. Bush. And so again, as the person said, he never pardoned his son, Neil, because Neil was not his son, and no context is required. All the more reason to watch and read with some level of scrutiny. Over the next 2 days, you're going to see my commentaries that deal with how to discern truth from error, how to exercise discernment. We've needed it more than ever before. First of all, let me thank Megan for her help engineering the program today. Steve, thank you for producing the program. Tomorrow is our Millennial Roundtable. I think you will really enjoy that conversation, and we'll be here all through the week talking about issues that are important to you. We'll see you back here tomorrow, right here on Point of View.
Who can you trust? Years ago, many of us could probably have provided a fairly long list, but today it seems we almost can't trust anyone. Educators don't even know what a woman is anymore. Many so-called public servants have shown all they care about is themselves. The FBI has been accused of bias, law-breaking, betrayal, and journalism. It's largely corrupt, with no Clark Kent standing up for truth, justice, and the American way. All of this is why Point of View Radio is more important than ever, and your part in supporting us is more needed than ever. Do your part today in supporting trustworthy truth. Stand with us and help push back the lies and the darkness. Visit pointofview.net. Don't put it off. Take a moment right now and click on that big blue button that says Donate Now. Or call to invest at 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
I just wanted to tell you, too, how much I have appreciated